Now, I want to take you way back to about 20-something years ago, okay? And believe me, this time machine adventure will be worth it. The trains in Sydney in the early 2000s, post the Olympics, were not fantastic. They were always running late. There were all sorts of problems. If one problem happened at one train station, the entire network would be knocked over. Slowly but surely, that system has been tried to be cleaned up over a long time. But of course, when the trains run late in any major capital city, it becomes a political problem. And back then, Bob Carr was the New South Wales Premier and was very, very good at politics when it came to the handling of things. I remember going to a press conference once as a young reporter where he announced that people who were already serving a life term will serve a life term in jail. He was good at being able to change the subject. And that government made a decision that rather than admit that the trains were constantly running late, they just changed the timetable, that literally late didn't mean late anymore. It was if it arrived within, I think, about 10 minutes of the actual time, then it technically wasn't late. So, ta-da! The late trains just disappear. Well, a perfect example of that now, 20 years later, is being deployed by Chris Bowen, one of many young Labor people who learnt via the feet and the ways of Bob Carr and the way that he did things way back when. Again, very successful politically. But we're not talking about trains running late here. We know that Chris Bowen, along with the Prime Minister, is trying to change the electricity system from the one that worked to the one that will make people feel good. It'll cost the best part of $1 trillion to do so. And of course, it's more expensive. But if you say it enough times, people will eventually forget that their bills keep going up, right?
The cheapest, most reliable form of energy for Australians, and that, of course, is renewable energy. Renewables, the cheapest form of energy.
Cheapest energy prices going forward.
Renewable energy is incredibly cheap.
Now, for 15 years that I've been honoured enough to be sitting here and in your lounge room or wherever you happen to watch the show, I've never been in denial of climate change nor the potential benefits of things like renewable energy. But what I have said, regardless of whom the person is who's pushing it or the leader who was promising it, the cost of transition was always going to be the problem for me. And the cost of transition has been obvious. As we go from a system that works to a completely new one that is being built, as I say, it could cost up to $1 trillion for us to do it. And yes, the government will stump up some of the money, private companies might absorb some of it, but it's pretty obvious who has to pay a big chunk of it. You.
Power prices are set to increase.
Power bills are climbing.
Australian families brace for even higher power bills.
So what is the trains aren't running late solution that Chris Bowen and the energy regulator are going to put in place? Well, bear with me because this one kind of takes the cake for the way modern politics works. The way it is going to work is that apparently energy retailers will be restricted to only increasing their prices once a year. In colloquial terms, this is a little bit like those politician pay rises. Yeah, people will bitch and moan for a couple of days and then they won't talk about it again for the rest of the year. But the reality is that if it is just a once a year increase, then those increases are going to be sharper and sharper and sharper until we eventually get to the time when all of the stuff has been built, it's all paid itself off, and then we start to see potentially what renewable energy is to the customer versus the existing systems that have worked. But let me read from this story today. The Australian Energy Market Commission has announced the changes on Thursday, entrenching a sweep of new rules designed to protect consumers from price shocks. Doesn't mean prices won't go up, but retailers will now be limited to lifting prices once a year and must ensure that customers who sign up to a plan with a temporary benefit do not roll over to one that is higher than the default price. Further, there is now a ban on what the AMEC calls unreasonably high penalties for not paying a bill on time. There's also a ban on fees, except for network charges, for vulnerable customers. Okay, there's no real problem with that, but still, you can imagine once a year, and they're going to pretend, oh, it's not our fault, it's somebody else making the decision. It's exactly the same logic as the trains, and exactly the same logic as pay rises for MPs. Providers must also limit fees and charges to reasonable costs for all other consumers. But interestingly, on the very same day that the government was finding a way to kind of hide the reality of the cost from one energy system to the new energy system. And remember, at the election just been, they promised no cuts to electricity prices in the way they had previously promised at the election before this. So with no promise for your power bills to go down, we've just found a way that your power bills will go up. It just won't be as randomly as it has been in the past. Therefore, everyone's annoyed for a couple of days. We'll make the announcement, the week before Christmas? They'll do it on the King's birthday public holiday. You know how all this is going to work. And all of it will, of course, politically be amazing. And anyone who talks about power prices being an electoral problem, it's just a crazy person making stuff up, right? This is a classic example about public policy moving from jumping into the pot of boiling water to the frog in boiling water, where slowly but surely it turns warmer and warmer until it is too late to realise it's boiling and you are cooked. But on the very same day that that announcement was being made, what about people who owe money to Jim Chalmers? And by that I mean the federal government, and by that I mean, of course, the Australian Taxation Office. Well, it's very different, you see. If you are late with your payments on a power bill, it will be basically illegal to have to pay a fine for that. But if you are late with money to the Australian Tax Office, guess what's going to happen? With over $50 billion in outstanding tax debt owed to the Australian Tax Office, the government wants to make it much less attractive for people to delay paying their tax bills. However, the rules are changing, and accountants warn that recently passed legislation by the federal government regarding the tax deductibility of ATO interest has potential to push struggling small businesses over the edge and into liquidation. From July the 1st, if you owe money to the Australian Tax Office, you will no longer be able to claim a tax deduction on the interest that they charge you. So let's be very clear. The private companies that sell you the electricity, that the government is forcing them to change the sources by which electricity is created, they can't charge any extra fines for late payments. If you're late with a payment to the Australian Tax Office, that system changes and the interest that is going to be charged goes through the roof. Let me continue with some of the analysis about what took place here today. Talk about a double standard, anyone? Without tax deductibility, the Australian Tax Office interest rate of 10.78% from July 1 becomes an effective interest rate of 14.37% for small businesses and an effective interest rate of 20% for individuals on the highest marginal tax rate. So again, don't you love this? Rules for the power industry, because that causes political problems. If you end up owing a tax bill, if you are late with paying that tax bill because maybe you don't have the money, no mercy for you. Instead, jack it up, jack it up, jack it up.